There isn't anything quite like speaking. Um, it's been pretty well documented that there's quite a number of animals and creatures that are pretty complex in how they communicate, but so far as we're aware, human beings are the ones who do extensive uh, verbal, written symbolism to represent reality and translate their interpretation of reality. And I think English has 25,000 or so words by now, and it's always growing and always changing. It's like a bit of an organism in and of itself. But yeah, so far as we know, uh, you can look very far in all directions, and you won't find anything that does it quite like humans anywhere. Um, and it's fitting because Earth is such a, let's say, diverse place, with much to be discovered even here. I mean, I think I'll be pretty interested to find out what's going on in the oceans. I mean, even just the thought is very interesting to know what's going on just in all the depths. But it's this interesting synthesis too because as we speak, we're on the bleeding edge of our organism, uh, in one of its highest functions. This mix of memory and sort of real time contextual analysis and this direction into the future all at the same time. It's like this triple threat of activity. And while speaking, I've noticed it's a hindrance to focus on it too much. It's a hindrance to focus on your face too much. Even your extremities, your body, it will hinder you to focus your attention too much on anything in particular. Speaking seems to be a whole um, body process. And if you spend too much time thinking on a particular part of you, it will seem to siphon too much of the bandwidth of our attention and slow speaking down and confuse it a bit, to be honest. And you can kind of notice this. I mean, if you're kind of an astute observer, you can kind of tell when people are focusing a bit too much on their face and how their face appears while speaking, or they're focused a bit too much on their body language and sort of trying to show body language. And what I've noticed, like if speaking, if you're not good at it, one of the best things to focus on, even just for a second. I mean, it doesn't do you much good to like continuously focus on any part of your body in particular, but if you're going to sort of clear your attention and reset it and give it a place to go, and then to sort of let it fall back into your entire body, you should focus on the tongue, um, even just momentarily, because you obviously can't see the tongue, so your attention being there won't be noticed by anybody, even yourself. And that's the thing. It's not just putting attention somewhere specifically in the body uh, that slows down speaking. It is that occurrence plus the listener noticing, and then you noticing that they're noticing, that further slows down speaking. There's like this constant reverberation going on between people, and it really is constant. And when we watch people speak, uh, it, our listening is also sort of a full body thing. It evokes all sorts of sensations and feelings. It's actually pretty amazing the degree to which somebody simply speaking paints such vivid pictures. And I've said in the past that there are some people who I really like to listen to because it's a common occurrence that the things they say and what that actually paints on my imagination is quite nice. And that has a lot to do with simply who they are, you know, and who I am. I mean, it just seems to be naturally enjoyable. And on the other end, which I don't know, I might say is actually most people, I don't gravitate towards so intensely. And then on the farthest end, I would say I would avoid on purpose. Not to be crude, but it's just the case, and we all do this, really. We all have this sort of, you know, maybe not so specific, more felt list of people we gravitate toward and people we have the opposite. But speaking, as I've said too, also ends up being a sort of hypnosis. Um, and I mean that again in a non derogatory, non manipulative way. It simply is. Um, a good speaker carries you along to a place, really. And it's hard to say exactly what a good speaker is. You just know it when you see it. But a good speaker is certainly very good at the synthesis of memory, context assessment, and direction. And if you're the sort of person who involves yourself, let's say, in a lot of conversations, and you come away from those conversations uh, with the overall sense that your mind, let's say, your ideas are more organized, then it says some just as much about you as it does the people that you speak with. And a good speaker quite often leaves people thinking and saying things like, that makes sense. I understand what you mean by that. I totally get that. I see what you mean, you know. A good speaker does not confuse you. They actually organize you. Um, and it's this internal geography that is extremely vast but not organized. That speaking can come along and suddenly bring this into organization. Like, there's been so many times where somebody has said something and the words clearly pulled together things that I already knew, but made them clear in this new way that suddenly almost took it from this vast ocean like abstract area and brought it into the area of the known or the understood. And even right now, as I'm talking, since I don't know exactly what I'm going to say, saying things out loud are different than thinking about them. Because uh, while we do intentionally think about things, a lot of the time what's happening is our thoughts have us. And we can't really help what we think about. And sometimes it's relevant and sometimes it's not. But I'm actually learning as I talk. Because of the gap between the deep pool of unconscious, irrelevant information that comes to be through words, since words are this almost 0 point where things go from negative to positive, or however you might want to categorize it. But it's almost like I'm learning in real time as I say it. And it's interesting that that happens. And some of the best times in my life have been with some people I've known for years, some people I've just met, where it's just a conversation that lasts a very long time, you know. Um, because there's something about talking to another person especially when it gets a little deeper, that is very satisfying. It actually seems to generate something, you know. It's not just relaying information. It's like you're two people who are organizing, and you both come away a little different. Um, and There's this feeling I remember. I remember when I was younger, when I was shy, for sure. I remember when I would say things, the feeling that I would harbor as I spoke was an inward pressure. As I spoke, I was aware that what I was saying was revealing my own existence. I was aware that I was translating my internal activity and my interpretations into words out into the world. And I was aware that as I was saying them, people were hearing it. And I was mostly aware of the people hearing it part. And that's where my attention was for the most part. Um, Not just my interpretation and the words and saying the words, but it was mostly in the viewer, the person I was talking to, how they must hear this. And at some point, that changed to where it was far more of a mix. When it's time to talk, now, I feel more of an outward pressure, let's say. And my attention is less fixed on how what I'm saying must sound, because I've had enough conversations and spoken to enough people that makes it to where the words I most commonly use and the things that I've come to understand and my general philosophy and worldview has been received in such a way that I don't worry about how it'll be received when I'm just sort of speaking off the cuff. I've already gotten enough feedback from enough people who I consider respectable, intelligent, very reasonable, to know that what I'm saying has made enough sense to have a strong desire to continue to have very revealing and deep conversations. Let's put it that way. So now, over time, my fixation when I'm talking is less on myself, less on the listener, and more on the general ideas that I have. But when it's time to listen, I completely switch gears. The interest that I have in what I am saying switches into the interest I have in what you're saying. Because what I've just said is now part of you, in a way, let's say, and you've synthesized what I've just said, and now you're going to say something that is a synthesis of all that you know, how you interpret this context, and the direction you're going to go with what you say. And I'm interested in that. And then as I'm listening to that, I can feel this sort of movement, intellectually, whatever you want to call it. And I hit this moment where I'm thrilled to say what I'm about to say. And I listen all the way through, and that moment where I want to respond is going to change, because the sentence, the words that are coming out change their meaning and context as the sentence develops. When you say I love, that's its meaning in incomplete context. You could just say cake, or you could say I love to hate cake. because I love it so much. The sentence and the words continue to develop as the sentence goes on, and you don't really know the meaning of the words until the sentence is complete. So there's this continued reverberation in a good conversation where there's very little misunderstanding, and it continues to grow and grow like an organism. And if there is a misunderstanding, the way it's handled is as if both people want to get back to understanding. Because honestly, that's, I guess you could say, the opposite of how some would interpret that, because some people want the misunderstanding. There are just some people who are that way. But if your manner of speaking is so well and so refined that you can say things that are very hard to dispute, to be honest, isn't about anybody who can consciously and continuously aim to refute things that are even speculative, because nobody wants to look foolish. But the human being is very interesting. I'm almost 40, if you can believe that now. And some of the most interesting things that I do involve reading or listening to speaking in some form or another. And for me personally, while I'm reading, I have this very vivid imagination of what this person is trying to convey, a very vivid imagination of the scene. It actually feels like a place. And I remember the first time I read a book and then saw the movie later, I remember being let down because the scenes and the characters weren't what I thought they were, And it's like that cliche that the book is always better. For me, too, it's also, for me personally, speaking for me is better than writing. As much as I love writing, for me, something is lost when I just write it. And this is something that's interesting that I've noticed. We can sort of adopt temperaments and attitudes. Like when I was younger, I used to think a person had their attitude, and that was that, and that's just how they were. But it's completely interchangeable. It's almost like outfits. Your personality is what it is, and you are who you are in the deepest ways. But the attitude is almost like the outermost layer. The one that has the least attachment to a person, but is still unique to them in the way it's acted out. And this is also dependent on your energy too. Like if you, if you're not eating enough, if you're like very, very sick, if something very serious is going on, it's much less possible to just change your attitude. If you don't have it to give, then you really won't be able to do much about that, because it does have to do with how much energy you actually have, as a person. But you can completely change your attitude, and some people change your attitude by their own existence in a weird way. Like when you go to see a stand-up comic, just that very person, that very setting is going to change your attitude, something more akin to humor. If you go to a Broadway show and it's very dramatic, it's unlikely you're going to be tuned towards laughter. And it's a very strange thing when a person's attitude is completely out of context. We kind of look at that person like, all right, what this person, what is this, Um, and it is a lot of that affects the way we convey what we know, the way we speak. And when some people speak, it's quite strange. It's like people listen, and it's taken to heart, and it's adopted, and it becomes all but fact. And when some people speak, it's quite the opposite. And I'm kind of interested in what like actually makes the difference there, because it's such a massive range. And I'm almost immediately inclined to say that it's incalculable factors, just a near infinite number of factors. But there always gets to this point where there are some things that just cannot be said. It's like the ability to speak has certain limitations. And I think I've said in the past, it's near impossible to actually convey the flavor of steak to somebody who's never had steak. You eventually just have to say, go get the steak and eat it. you know, at some point, the true nature of language as symbology becomes evident, you know. No matter how many times, no matter how many ways you describe a delicious, juicy, medium rare steak, um, you're never going to get all of it, ever. So, the levels of speaking um, are the most satisfactory when somebody is able to scrape the deepest of their essence and put that into words, you know. And the things that really have a gravity are those things that people manage to say that have a universality to them, that you instantly recognize and feel as the truth, even some very abstract things. And it's one of those things that feels mundane because it's so ubiquitous, speaking. But it's different to say it out loud. It's almost like that's the final layer. And once you say something, you can't take it back because it does imprint. It actually does change something. And I'm seriously impressed when somebody can take an event and deliver multiple interpretations of one event that are all true. One of the most interesting scenarios that I can even conceive is something I've mentioned a couple times. It's the situation of the courtroom, where it's one event and two completely opposite conclusions. And you have people who are very serious and very smart arguing totally opposite interpretations of the same event. And obviously, in the end, you have to have people decide who was right, you know. And there's been times when the correct answer has been pretty clear, but the defense was so compelling that it made it to where you really couldn't give that clear answer. And in that situation, that's like a stew of chemicals of different people blending and mixing. And I've always been one to say that when two people mix, it's very much like a chemical reaction, you know. Something major can happen just like that. And I'm the sort of person who can't have the same conversation twice. And I just can't have duplicate conversations with people, and it's not really a rule or something that's done on purpose. I really don't even like saying the same thing twice, and if I have to, then I'll usually just reference the fact that I've said it before and say it in this new context. Because each conversation or series of conversations that I have with people are completely unique to them. And if I'm saying something to somebody, it's unique to them and it's theirs. And it would just seem insincere in a way to have duplicate conversations to say the same thing to more than one person, you know. And I can't help but not duplicate something like that because it's so personal, you know. And over time, it's made it to where I have a very good memory of most of what I said to the people that I know. And each relationship feels very different because there isn't any overlap in any excessive way to speak of. They're all completely unique. And again, that's not an intentional thing. It's just sort of how it's felt. And I can have conversations over and over and over again with people for years even, and still be extremely interested in what they're saying. Because it's more or less how I am as a person and how they are as a person. That is this chemical type thing. And I really couldn't see it being any other way, you know. And of course, you know, there is some ability to anticipate um, what somebody might say based off of what they've said previously, but it's usually completely spontaneous. And my appreciation for conversations has certainly grown over the years. Um, you know, that's for sure. And it is strange how specific that can be. Um, some people, no matter how much I theoretically know about them, they're always still completely fascinating. And if someone is beautiful, I might reuse that word quite often. But among that, there's a natural inclination to just describe it in as many ways as possible. And even people whose beliefs I'm already aware of, if they're good at speaking, if they're good at conveying, translating what they believe, it can still be interesting. You know, for example, like if somebody is part of a political party or clearly on one side of the political spectrum, it's kind of a rare thing. It's less common because it seems um, the commitment to a political party kind of gives way to a predictability. But some people can pull it off, and especially if that's your job, that's a little bit more impressive. And as time goes, as the days go, there are continuously new events happening. And I have a certain respect for somebody who still has a political bend, but is able to remain objective in the way they interpret events. And I really wonder, um, as human beings, if this is our, I guess, final form, speaking like this, is there going to be a time where we have some other form of communication? Is it going to be better? I mean, I think it would have to be if it's something that renders speaking obsolete. Like we think about the possibility of just, transmitting thoughts, which we actually kind of do in a way now, but it's not so direct as to just have one thought go from one mind to another. But I'm genuinely curious. And it's interesting too how some people we become so close with just with speaking. How connected you can become with somebody just through speaking. It's surprised me so far in life. And I'm also interested in the way we think about ourselves. It's been said once that if we hypothetically could see ourselves or we met ourselves and ran into ourselves at some point, we wouldn't have an easy time recognizing ourselves. And imagine having a conversation with yourself. Like if you could sit down with yourself, could you learn something? You know, is the nature of conversation and speaking truly so spontaneous that both parties would walk away having learned something new? I think absolutely. Because even an identical copy of oneself would be within this reverberation that generates something brand new. Even if they're completely the same, the back and forth nature of a conversation completely generates a new third thing. And for me personally, as I was saying, the things that I say are for specific people, you know. And I remember sometimes I would leave conversations and I would genuinely feel different having left that conversation. Like my core self really never changes, you know. But those more peripheral elements, I could actually feel it changing, you know, as I learned. And it's not so much always the content of the conversation, but it is the person who delivered it and how they delivered it and how they said it, how they went about themselves. In a strange way, knowing that certain sorts of people exist the way they do can cause some of the deeper change as you yourself rearranges and interacts with that. Not so much of us is so pliable so as to be so easily changed, but I can't help but view it like concentric circles that extend further and further out, and the further out you go, the more easily changeable these things are, you know. So much so that the furthest layer out is constantly changing, but the further you go in, the more it takes to change. And I can never make it in a shallow conversation for more than just a few minutes. I always end up going somewhere deep. It doesn't matter where it is or what it's about. It just happens. You know, it's like it can't be helped. You know, And it is genuinely fascinating to watch somebody do what they do. And you know that feeling when you vehemently disagree with somebody? It's like they say something and you completely disagree with it. A good speaker can handle just about any situation. Very rarely does the exchange of words get so out of hand that both parties leave, angry. That is, in a way, inevitable as human beings. It might happen, you know, extremely rarely, but knowing what that feels like with certain people um, changes you, depending on who the person is. But that feeling when you completely disagree with somebody, or even other situations where you have to say something that might be difficult to say, something that you know is going to be large in impact. The way a person says something can be complete magic. And I'm not at all exaggerating about that. A person can take very hard news and walk away optimistic or hopeful. You can completely disagree with somebody, and by the end of that exchange, you can have them in a position to where they're thinking, I completely get that. That makes sense. And it really is like releasing this geography. Because the more you know about somebody, it starts to fill in these places in you. I think I said once, it's like, I remember early on when I first got interested in psychology, the subject of serial killers inevitably came up. And in that situation, those people are trying to dehumanize, let's say, or make a person as little of a human as possible to even make these acts possible. But if a person starts speaking, starts saying personal things about them, their name, whether or not they have children, whether or not they're married, personal things about them, it makes it more and more difficult for these people to behave in this way. Because this attachment starts to spring about. And the reason why I would focus on that situation, because it's a unique situation where there is a person consciously trying to not have any attachment whatsoever. I mean, to the highest degree, I think even that's probably possible. And you have another person who, more than anything, wants some sort of attachment because it might be the thing that saves their life. And it has. Some people have, just by speaking, entered enough volume of themselves into this person and changed them in real time, actually physiologically caused physiological responses in that person, caused them to feel, caused emotion, and they couldn't do it, and that has happened more than once. Because speaking as the synthesis of memory, real-time context, and direction into the future is, in and of itself, an act of motion. There is a momentum that builds and builds through conversation. And the feeling that it evokes in people is also a motion. And the emotion that comes of that is quite extensive. And a really good conversation, it really feels like time just flies by. It feels like it's only been a few minutes. It could be 2 hours. the sense of motion, the sense of a bit of a voyage or a trip is quite extreme. And it's such an interesting thing that this can happen through a person translating their totality through sounds. And you can feel it as you speak, you know. It's, and of all the words we have at our disposal, it seems for each of us there's sort of a narrow band that we kind of stick to, you know, even me. We have a preference for certain words. Certain words are more appealing to us and who we are and the way we use them. And the art really is to get those words in as many contexts as possible. And I like English because it's relatively efficient. It can take the same sound and change its meaning based off the surrounding words, based off the context. And it really is more of a musical situation than it is just raw information being relayed. I think of speaking as more of a musical situation because there's more of an emotional attachment to the words, you know. I mean, imagine a situation where somebody is speaking just in this very dry way, you know, where there's no ups and downs in cadence, where it's just dry words being said. Is that not very boring? I mean, not even in a judgmental or a critical way. I mean, just objectively, is that not something that you would go out of your way to hear versus words that are just saturated with feeling? And I, like I was saying, remember that feeling when I was younger of the spotlight from the external world landing on myself as I said things because I was less sure of what I was saying. I had less of a record of an established set of circumstances where I had said things that were so well received that I could say them more confidently and more refined as ideas got better and better. And even at that age, I hated repeating things. You know, I didn't like the idea of duplicates. It just didn't seem, you know, if I would say something almost verbatim to another person that I had said it to somebody else before, it would almost seem like I'm robbing them of a personalized conversation, you know, which sounds a little strange, but it's just how it felt. It felt like it was not for them, you know. And that's how it feels with romantic situations as well and friendships as well, you know. And I really do believe if you put 1,000 people together in a room, there's always going to be somebody for whom your chemicals are the most pleasing in terms of how they mix. And we have a whole planet full of people, and there's more and more people from different places getting together and noticing each other and talking. And it's interesting too when you add the internet into the mix, because the internet is a place where anonymity can be provided, and anonymity completely changes the way people talk. That spotlight, that personal spotlight, is almost completely removed. And interestingly, based off of what you're thinking about, if there is something that grabs your attention, it will change the way you speak. It's like I've said in the past, if you happen to be thinking about sex while you're talking to somebody, even if it's for just a second. It will kind of change the way you speak. Um, if you're thinking about something that is sad, obviously it'll change the way you speak. And it's interesting how a human being can have thoughts that actually cause physiological responses right here in the present. And sometimes those nostalgic memories evoke such strong responses. And for me personally, especially with age, it's kind of always been this way, but my appreciation for the entirety of a person is immense. Um, and I would certainly add that to the romantic context as well, because it's such an interesting sort of duopoly of the cliche saying, friends and lovers. There's definitely a reason why we think of it that way, because it's full, It sees the person as much of the entire person as there can be, you know. And with the limitations of speaking, um, it eventually crosses over into, as we would commonly say, that actions speak louder than words, indeed. Because words can intentionally mislead, obviously, and I would consider that a highly, I wouldn't recommend that, I wouldn't recommend misrepresenting reality intentionally, because it's gonna get you, man. It's gonna get you. It's only a matter of time. Don't think that you can beat the system. Don't think that you can beat reality and misrepresent the world. Especially those deeper things. You really don't want to do that, because that is going to come back on you. And it is true, as larger actions, even small actions, because let's say in a romantic situation, I'm highly interested in what you have to say. I'm highly interested in what you are saying, because it's you. And because I'm hearing everything that you say and my conversations are unique to you, I know you very well, and I can anticipate you. I know what you would likely want and likely need. And generally, my existence in that situation is going to make your existence all the better, because you're actually loved in that way. You're loved so much that I anticipate you. And I talk about that like this because it should be a really common thing, I think, because I think everybody kind of deserves somebody who says what's true and listens with the highest of interest, as if they know what they're hearing is true, and their behavior and actions reflect that. And speaking is near the highest level, I would say. It's not just speaking, it's a pattern of speaking. And it's hard to say exactly what it is that brings people together so deeply. But I would say, before you try to go too deep, you should know the subject matter, because there's nothing worse than somebody who just speaks in circles and never has a meaning, never gets to a point really, and actually kind of prides themselves on their ability to say nothing while still making sounds. I mean, that's one of the ultimate forms of patronizing, especially if you're a political figure. Like, that's just, you shouldn't be doing politics if you have nothing to say. Politics is the place where you should have the most to say, in as many possible ways that you can say it to convey it to the public. And we just don't have time for somebody who speaks in circles. And once I hear that once, I know that that's going to be a pattern. you just have to try your best to say what's true and what you know to be the best. I mean, it's really not that difficult. And I, of course, again, mostly refer to politicians because in this situation, you're going out of your way to manage things, to be in charge of things. So it's at the very least of your responsibilities to speak in concert with that. I mean, I really want this age of political figures who speak in a way that does not leave you walking away thinking, I understand that, I get that, I get why you did that. That makes total sense. It's quite the opposite. It's almost like planting little bombs of intentional distortion. And I think people got used to that, because we can get used to quite a bit. But we just don't have time for that. I don't care about that. It's boring. I actually want the United States to be as good as possible for as many people as possible. And I want to know how far this thing can go. Like, let's make some serious history here. Let's, see how far we can take it in the best way possible, of course. Don't overcorrect either. But, yeah, and me saying this and being aware of so many things and observing so many things, at the same time, it's quite easy and relaxed, being able to put a lot of words to a lot of things and describe a lot of things almost gives the impression that there's a lot of things that are under scrutiny, which isn't the case. It's an interesting ability to be able to word as many things as possible and still make sense, which is kind of the more difficult part. Because sense is as thin as reality itself. It's as thin as the existence of human beings, of life on Earth, of this beautiful planet itself. It's this highest place where the spot right under it is less than good sense. And the third place is even less than that. And by the time you get down the list, you're talking about something that is complete nonsense. It's But, I would be happy to see a situation where the words said are genuinely in line with what's been observed. And there's something about a passionate speaker that is automatically interesting, but it still has to make sense. It's almost like the two major components. And we live in the podcast era as well. And it's kind of been shown that we like long conversations, There was a time where we thought our attention spans were so short that we just continuously need short things, but podcasts are definitely pretty great. And I think it's because enough time is allowed for enough momentum to build in a conversation to penetrate those deeper layers to where the conversation becomes more and more granular, to where the two people are translating and revealing the things that are more and more true. And not just objectively true, because it can all be objectively true, but true with the weight of more belief and heavier thought into each subject. Because like I said, it's important to know what you're talking about. It's not so easy to speak highly confidently without knowing what you're talking about. Which seems kind of obvious, and it is. But today it's possible to be quite a generalist, to know a little about everything, enough to find the connections and associations to things that seem maybe not connected but actually are. And at the same time, it's possible to be a specialist in a few areas. But we can become quite knowledgeable these days. And it's hard to convey how much it actually is the way somebody speaks. It's interesting to see somebody who seems to have almost no self-consciousness, but who is highly aware of themselves and knows themselves quite well, but doesn't seem to show that in their way of existing. There's almost an innocence there. And if there is a form of innocence to protect, I would say that it's that. It's on the level of the human being, the soul itself. It's not anything in particular. It is the culmination of one's philosophy and how they feel on a day-to-day basis and how they interpret the world. And you don't see that very often. There are people who are quite able to live on two levels at once. One level being this sort of permanent state of naivety, almost innocence, able to continuously see the brand new in things that are old, that have been around, and at the same time be quite cunning, quite full of depth, and quite aware. It's this mix of spontaneity and discipline and pattern. And one of the few people that always comes to mind is Kramer from Seinfeld. He would be a good example of somebody who sort of has this way of living on two levels at the same time. And it is my belief that we are all kind of that way, maybe a little further in one direction than the other. We all kind of have access to these things, but not everybody brings those things out, because as we come in contact with different people, as our chemicals mix with different people, we bring different things out of each other, and in large part due to what we say. Like I've said in the past, there's been people who I've met who I've been told are one way, but end up being the exact opposite, or a completely different way. And something like romantic love is something that is so all-encompassing, yet very specific. We don't all evoke true romantic love out of each other. We just don't. But there are people who come into contact who do evoke that in the most profound way possible. And there are many things like that. There's been times where people have mixed and gotten together and done terrible things, who would definitely not have done those things otherwise, by the mixing of their chemicals. And it's hard to predict exactly how that's going to go all the time. There's always the kind of uncertainty, which is the element of that innocence that I was talking about, the spontaneity of it. And you can know somebody so well. You can have thousands of conversations. You can have exchanged millions of words even, and still bring out that part of each other that is new, life generating, energy generating, love generating, that will always keep you bound